Sections 2 and 3 of the A Deduction are very dense. A lot is happening in it, and we won't be talking about every detail, but we do want to get a good sense of what is going on here. Now, we have seen some introductory videos in which I talked about the basic underlying ideas of the deduction, right? The basic argumentation that should get us to where Kant wants us to get. But if you start reading section 2 of the A Deduction, you are going to find a lot of things that I did not talk about. So Kant is going to talk at length about his threefold synthesis, and there's going to be a lot of stuff about the imagination and the productive and reproductive imagination and so on and so forth, and so we want to get an understanding of that. Alright, let's look at the text. So here is what Kant says at A97. He tells us that since in such a thought there is more at work than the single faculty of thinking, namely the understanding, and the understanding itself as a faculty of cognition that is to be related to object also requires an elucidation of the possibility of this relation, we must first assess not the empirical but the transcendental constitution of the subjective sources that comprise the a priori foundations for the possibility of experience. Okay, so what Kant is saying here is this. In cognition, right, in the experience of objects even, in the experience of objects, several things come together. One of them is the understanding, but there's other things, definitely sensibility, and Kant is going to talk a lot about the imagination, although technically speaking, the imagination seems to be part of the understanding. In order to understand all of that, we've got to understand how all of those things work together, what they do. And we don't want to look at that from the perspective of empirical psychology, right? We're not interested in the kinds of things that a cognitive psychologist might be trying to find out in his lab. We want to do this a priori, that is transcendentally. And that means, like we should always recall this, what that means is that we are going to investigate these faculties insofar and to the extent that they are the a priori conditions for cognition, right? The a priori conditions for a knowledge of objects. So what we're going to wonder is really this: what is necessary for us to have cognition of objects? And so Kant says first, in what immediately follows this, a little bit more about cognition, right? He says that if every individual representation were entirely foreign to the other, as it were isolated and separated from it, then there would never arise anything like cognition, which is a whole of compared and connected representations, right? Cognition, that which ought to rise to the status of knowledge, it is all about comparing, right? It's all about connecting. We get all these representations, but a representation as such is nothing for us, right? It doesn't have the status of something that you could know. It doesn't have the status of an illusion either, or a dream or whatever. It can only gain that status, that sort of objectivity and that status of knowledge, after having been taken up in this process of comparing and connecting into a unity. Unity, that's going to be a very important point. And now Kant is going to go very quick, and he's going to say this. If therefore I ascribe a synopsis to sense, because it contains a manifold in its intuition, a synthesis must always correspond to this, and receptivity can make cognitions possible only if combined with spontaneity. This is now the ground of a threefold synthesis which is necessarily found in all cognition, that namely of the apprehension of the representations as modifications of the mind in intuition, of the reproduction of them in the imagination, and of their recognition in the concept. Okay, so we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail because Kant is going to talk about that in more detail. We have here then a threefold synthesis. So something is given in sensibility, but this by itself for Kant is not yet ready to be an object of knowledge. Right? It doesn't have the right structure, we could say. It doesn't have the right properties yet to be something that we can know. Something has to happen. What has to happen is a synthesis that is carried out by spontaneity, right? That is carried out by what's going to turn out to be our faculty of understanding. And this synthesis is threefold. Now, before we delve into the three folds, the three elements of this synthesis, I want to emphasize that when Kant says threefold, he's talking about three things that have to happen together, right? These are not three temporal stages. We don't have like the synthesis of apprehension in the intuition, and then afterwards the synthesis of reproduction in the imagination, and then afterwards the synthesis of recognition in the concept. These things require each other, right? They don't really make sense without each other. Okay, so that's what we want to understand. And so we get to 1 on the synthesis of apprehension in the intuition. Now, Kant starts out by reminding us that absolutely every representation belongs to inner sense and so falls in the manifold of time. And so anything he's going to say about manifolds, whether time or space, given that everything is at least part of this manifold of time, it's going to apply to every representation. Okay. Every intuition, Kant writes then, contains a manifold in itself, which, however, would not be represented as such. That is, it would not be represented as a manifold if the mind did not distinguish the time in the succession of impressions on one another. For as contained in one moment, no representation can ever be anything other than absolute unity. Now, in order for unity of intuition to come from this manifold, it is necessary first to run through and then to take together this manifold, which action I call the synthesis of apprehension, since it is aimed directly at the intuition, which to be sure provides a manifold but can never affect this as such, and indeed as contained in one representation, without the occurrence of such a synthesis. What Kant is saying is this: intuition might give me a manifold, but by itself, sensibility cannot give this as a manifold, right? So take time, right? I am given in time all these different like moments of experience, but I'm not by that already grasping them as this manifold that is time, right? There's a big difference between a succession of appearances being given to me and me representing and understanding them as a succession of appearances, right? I can have an appearance and an appearance and an appearance and an appearance and an appearance. Okay, that's nice. That was a succession of appearances. There's nothing in that that allows me to grasp and understand them as a succession of appearances. And that means that even if my intuition has the form of time, that doesn't mean that I have any grasp of time, right? Anything that is given to me might be given to me in time, in this temporal succession. That doesn't mean that I have any grasp of the temporal succession, and thereby any grasp of time. And so what needs to happen is I need to run through and take together this manifoldness, right? I have to sort of be able to see all these like little elements for what they are, namely elements, and then take them together into a unity. Because in a manifold, if I represent something to myself as a manifold, I'm representing a many as one. And that is something that sense itself doesn't do. So we can know a priori, Kant says, that because this is necessary to even have the a priori representation of space and time, which we have, we can know that we have this a priori ability to affect this synthesis of the apprehension. Okay, so we have a pure synthesis of apprehension. Now, Kant is going to talk about the imagination. And we are going to find out, and I want to read this first, which is like at the very, very end of this number 2. Kant is going to tell us that this synthesis of reproduction, as he calls it, and the synthesis of apprehension, which was in number 1, they are, and now I'm reading, the synthesis of apprehension is therefore inseparably combined with the synthesis of reproduction. Right? So these are not two different things. Right? We're now going to think about the same process, like the same act of synthesis that has to make it possible for objects to be given to me in experience. It has a different side. Okay, and that's a side that has to do apparently with the imagination. Alright, now Kant is actually setting this up in a rather complicated way, because Kant is first going to tell us about empirical laws. He has a lot of talk about a lot of empirical laws. He has this nice example about cinnabar. He has a nice example about the climate, and so on and so forth. We had better hope that there is some, like, I don't know, some regularity in the appearances, because otherwise we could never exercise really our, well, that which you might call custom, right? Our ability to associate. Okay, so here's what Kant says when he comes to the second paragraph of number 2. There must therefore be something that itself make possible this reproduction of the appearances by being the a priori ground of a necessary synthetic unity of them. One soon comes upon this if one recalls that appearances are not things in themselves, but rather the mere play of our representations, which in the end come down to determinations of the inner sense. Now, if we can demonstrate that even our purest a priori intuitions provide no cognition except insofar as they contain the sort of combination of the manifold that makes possible a thoroughgoing synthesis of reproduction, then this synthesis of the imagination would be grounded, even prior to all experience, on a priori principles. And one must assume a pure transcendental synthesis of this power, which grounds even the possibility of all experience. Okay, and I think all of that is rather, rather hard to grasp at first. Now, Kant is talking here about the imagination. And Kant is going to distinguish between two different uses, maybe, of the imagination. There's the reproductive imagination, and there is the productive imagination. So the reproductive imagination, it would be something like this, right? I have, I don't know, whenever I hear somebody knock on my door, then quickly the door opens and my wife appears, right? That happens to me a number of times. And now, like, somebody knocks on my door, and immediately sort of the image or the idea pops up of my wife appearing in the doorway. Okay, that would be an instance of the reproductive imagination, right? It reproduces something that I have found in the empirical world, right? I have learned to associate these things, and in the right circumstance, bam, this other idea might pop up. All right, so it allows me to sort of reproduce something that has been given to me in experience. That's nice. Clearly, though, this is something that doesn't seem to have a transcendental function, not as such. I mean, the very idea of reproduction, of producing again, of repeating something that had been given in empirical stuff, in experience, suggests that it's not a priori, right? And if it's not a priori, it can't be a transcendental use of something. Now, there is also the productive imagination. And this is not necessarily, I would say, a different imagination. It's maybe a different use, or use of the imagination, a different way in which the imagination comes up. And the productive imagination is what allows us to, I think, posit something, right? So Kant's examples often involve our creation in intuition of, let's say, geometrical ideas. So I draw for myself a triangle, something like that, sort of in my mind. That would be an example of the productive imagination. But I think we can see this far more generally as the ability to posit two things belonging together, for instance. Right? If I posit heaviness being cinnabar and redness as belonging together, using Kant's own example about a specific ore, that would seem to be like this this ability to posit to posit a property like that, and to posit these properties like together in sort of as belonging together in intuition, as co-occurring in space and time. That would seem to be a productive use of the imagination. Okay, here is Kant's own story, and he uses this example of a line. Now it is obvious that if I draw a line in thought, or think of the time from one known to the next, or even want to represent a certain number to myself, I must necessarily first grasp one of these manifold representations after another in my thoughts. But if I were always to lose the preceding representations, the first part of the line, the preceding parts of time, or the successively represented units, from my thoughts and not reproduce them when I proceed to the following ones, then no whole representation and none of the previously mentioned thoughts, not even the purest and most fundamental representations of space and time, could ever arise. Right? So here Kant is telling us that any act where I try to do what I described under 1, right? Any time that I try to affect the synthesis of apprehension into intuition, I had better be able to reproduce in the imagination, or using the imagination, all the previous elements of whatever it is that I am trying to grasp as one. Right? So if I am trying to understand this succession of moments, well, when I come to the next moment, like in running through and taking them together, I had better be able to reproduce the earlier moments, right? And keep doing that and sort of get them all in mind at the same time and thereby grasp them as a whole. So this very notion that we were talking about in section 1, this grasping the manifold as a manifold, it requires me to be able to reproduce the elements of that manifold as needed so that they are there for me to grasp them in this single grasp, in this single representation. So that is why the synthesis of apprehension is inseparably combined with the synthesis of reproduction. And since the former constitutes the transcendental ground of the possibility of all cognition in general, the reproductive synthesis of the imagination belongs among the transcendental actions of the mind, and with respect to this we will also call this faculty the transcendental faculty of the imagination. Okay, so we need this imagination as the faculty that can reproduce or actively posit, as we will later see, elements of experience in order to ever affect any synthesis, whether it's empirical or pure. But Kant says this is not enough. This is still not enough to make the experience of an object possible. And we can already understand that a little bit, because maybe this is enough, and Kant is going to use this term later on, maybe this is enough kind of to sort of give us an image of something, right, where we have a lot of things, but we see them as an image, as belonging together. But it's definitely not yet an object, right? Because what is missing is the idea of a rule or a necessity, right? What is missing here is the idea that what we grasp is something more than merely the pure subjective play of perceptions, right? We need something else. We need this relation to an object. Otherwise, we don't have anything that could be taken up into cognition. There's nothing to compare or connect. You can't compare or connect things that are essentially loose and separate, right? And even if I bring a bunch of elements of experience together in a kind of image, well, unless there's some ground, some rule-bound ground underneath that could connect this image to other images, it is inert. It doesn't do anything. I can't take it up in cognition. It is not a possible element for knowledge. Okay, so we need something else, and this is clearly where rules and concepts are going to have to come in. And so that is number 3, on the synthesis of recognition in the concept. without consciousness that which we think is the very same as that what we thought a moment before, all reproduction in the series of representations would be in vain. And here I would say that in vain probably means that no real synthesis is taking place. Right? So this third step is another necessary element of this one threefold synthesis. For it would be a new representation in our current state, which would not belong at all to the act through which it had been gradually generated, and its manifold would never constitute a whole, since it would lack the unity that only consciousness can obtain for it. If in counting I forget that the units that now hover before my senses were successively added to each other by me, then I would not cognize the generation of the multitude through this successive addition of one to the other, and consequently I would not cognize the number, for this concept consists solely in the consciousness of this unity of the synthesis. So what I think Kant is trying to tell us here is that we need, in order to grasp something as an object, as something that could be taken up in knowledge, what I definitely need is the idea that this unity, this synthesis, has been generated on the basis of a rule. Right? It has been generated in the way that it had to be generated. So in counting, if I, let's say, try to add 3 to 5 and I end up with these sort of maybe 8 dots floating before my mental eye to make it like way more like visual than Kant wants to do, but let's assume that that's what happens. Well, unless I grasp that I got to this mental state through following a certain rule, then I have no grasp that this is the outcome of my sum, right? I can't grasp it as the outcome of my sum. If I try to sort of synthesize a bunch of elements together into a time in which something happened, well, then I better grasp them as actually having to be synthesized in that order, right? Because otherwise I'm not really representing anything that could be called objective. I mean, if I just take some experiences and sort of synthesize them together in a time and say, ooh, well, that doesn't have any objective status, right? There's nothing there really. It's got to be done on the basis of some kind of rule. I've got to be able to recognize some kind of necessity in the very process, in the very product of the synthesis. Otherwise, no synthesis has really taken place at all. Now, Kant is going to tell us that it is the one consciousness that unifies the manifold that has been successively intuited and then also reproduced into one representation. This is going to be very important for Kant, that what unifies all my representations is this one consciousness. And how does it unify them? It unifies them by putting them into a framework of rules, by positing a certain necessity to which they have to conform, or to which they must conform. Right? Not have to in the sense of, oh, they're bad things if they don't do it. I mean, if they don't conform to it, they couldn't ever rise to the level of objective experience. Okay, then Kant is going to introduce, and we talked about this already in an earlier video, the idea of the something in general is X that we have to sort of posit. This is the transcendental object. It is that which is regarded as that which is opposed to our cognitions being determined at pleasure or arbitrarily, rather than being determined a priori, since insofar as they are to relate to an object, our cognitions must also necessarily agree with each other in relation to it. That is, they must have that unity that constitutes the concept of an object. So this is another way of saying what I've just been saying. Right? In order to be anything that could be taken up into knowledge, these things have to be bound by rules, by a certain necessity, and the idea of that kind of rule, the kind of rule for experience, is precisely the idea of an object. Okay. The unity that the object makes necessary can be nothing other than the formal unity of the consciousness in the synthesis of the manifold of the representations. There's nothing else. There's no content to the object accept that it is the object that is posited by the unitary consciousness as that which grounds the necessarily related experiences. So, if the object makes necessary a unity, and it does, well, that is the formal unity of the consciousness. These two things are related, like in such a way that they can't be pried apart from each other, as I argued or had Kant argue in our previous video. Hence we say that we cognize the objects if we have affected synthetic unity in the manifold of intuition. But this is impossible if the intuition could not have been produced through a function of synthesis in accordance with a rule that makes the reproduction of the manifold necessary a priori and a concept in which this manifold is united possible. Now this unity of rule determines every manifold and limits it to conditions that make the unity of apperception possible, and the concept of this unity is the representation of the object is X, which I think through those predicates of, in this case, a triangle. So using the example of a triangle, Kant tries to explain to us this necessary relation between the rule positing subject and this object, which basically is that which is posited as grounding all the rules that experience has to follow. Okay, Kant then tells us that he calls this this unity of the subject, he calls it the transcendental apperception. And let me say again that apperception is basically Kant's word for self-consciousness. And transcendental is, it has to do with its role in transcendental philosophy. This is the subject of transcendental philosophy. It is that to which the appearances appear. It is that which posits the transcendental object, and so on and so forth. Just this transcendental unity of apperception, and I'm now at A108, just this transcendental unity of apperception, however, makes out of all possible appearances that can ever come together in one experience a connection of all of these representations in accordance with laws. For this unity of consciousness would be impossible if in the cognition of the manifold the mind could not become conscious of the identity of the function by means of which this manifold is synthetically combined into one cognition. Okay, let's say that again. For this unity of consciousness would be impossible if in the cognition of the manifold the mind could not become conscious of the identity of the function by means of which this manifold is synthetically combined into one cognition. What Kant is saying here is that this unity of consciousness is impossible, so we can't have transcendental apperception unless the mind, in the cognition of the manifold, can become consciousness of a certain identity. Right? So unless the mind can recognize itself as in every instance sort of performing the same act of synthesis, then it couldn't become conscious of all of this as belonging together, as a unity, and therefore that mind could not be a unity. Right? And this relates directly to what I said in the previous video. Like, the way that we achieve self-consciousness is through an awareness of the act of synthesis by which we posit this this framework of rules for empirical for experience to fill, really. Unless there were an identity of this act, it wouldn't be the act of the same transcendental subject. Right? That is basically a way of understanding this. So a unity of consciousness requires that the mind can become conscious of the identity of the function by means of which this manifold is synthetically combined into one cognition. Thus the original and necessary consciousness of the identity of oneself, so I am of course a priori aware that all my experiences are mine, this is at the same time a consciousness of an equally necessary unity of the synthesis of all appearances in accordance with concepts that is in accordance with rules that not only make them necessarily reproducible, but also thereby determine an object for their intuition, that is the concept of something in which they are necessarily connected. For the mind could not possibly think of the identity of itself in the manifoldness of its representations, and indeed think this a priori, if it did not have before its eyes the identity of its action, which subjects all synthesis of apprehension, which is empirical, to a transcendental unity, and first makes possible their connection in accordance with a priori rules. So again, if what my mind could be aware of was only the manifoldness, like the all these different little things that are given in intuition, I couldn't be self-conscious of myself as a unity. What is the unity that I can apprehend in the mind? Only the unity of the act of synthesis. Only the unity of the synthesis which brings together all these little elements into this one framework of experience, this one world, this one posited, coherent framework of laws. That is Kant's fundamental claim and conception here. To return to something that I talked about in a very early video, video 9 maybe, something like that, I talked a little bit about Russell, right? And Bertrand Russell said to Kant, he said, Kant, you know, this is all very nice, but you just assume that the mind is going to keep working the same way. But that's a merely empirical claim. So today 2 plus 2 is 4, that's nice, but maybe tomorrow the mind works differently. It has changed and 2 plus 2 is 5. We can now understand how totally wrong that criticism of Kant is. Right? Because the very self-consciousness of our minds, like the very unity and identity of my mind, requires a unity of the act of synthesis. And so some mind for which 2 plus 2 is 5 would be a mind that uses, I mean, for us even an unthinkable, and in fact everything that would be different from how our mind synthesizes things is for us unthinkable, but it would be an unthinkable act of synthesis, but definitely a different act of synthesis from the one that I am using, and so I could never be aware of that as my mind. Right? That doesn't make any sense. That's not the way that the Kantian system works. So Kant's claims are clearly transcendental and not empirical, even though they tell us something a priori about everything that happens or could happen in experience. Okay, we get the transcendental object, and we get a provisional explanation of the possibility of the categories. How are the categories possible? Well, you know, how is this association? I'm at A113. How is this association even possible? The ground of the possibility of the association of the manifold, insofar as it lies in the object, is called the affinity of the manifold. So the affinity of the manifold is something like it having the right structure to be put under rules. Right? And this seems like a very nice thing if you are, let's say, David Hume. Right? Oh, the world is so regular. Great. I mean, we are really in luck because we have no a priori reason for thinking that the world will be such that we can use our mental powers to find regularities and build up associations and do all of that nice good stuff that allows us to live like normal lives. Kant, of course, doesn't want to go that way. He says, I ask, therefore, how do you make the thoroughgoing affinity of the appearances, by means of which they stand under constant laws and must belong under them, comprehensible to yourselves? Like something like causation. How do you make that comprehensible? On my principles, it is easily comprehensible. All possible appearances belong as representations to the whole possible self-consciousness. But from this, as a transcendental representation, numerical identity is inseparable and certain a priori. Right? The mind is the mind. Right? It's the transcendental subject is necessarily an a priori a unity, because nothing can come into cognition except by means of this original apperception. Now, since this identity must necessarily enter into the synthesis of all the manifold of appearances Insofar as they are to become empirical cognition, the appearances are thus subject to a priori conditions with which their synthesis of apprehension must be in thoroughgoing accord. Since all the appearances are appearances for this transcendental perception, its unity is gonna be found in them, right? The appearances are always going to be bound by the a priori structure of how the unity of apperception, the transcendental unity of apperception, this transcendental apperception, posits the world of objects, the world of experience. Now, however, the representation of a universal condition in accordance with which a certain manifold can be posited is called a rule, and if it must be so posited a law, all appearances therefore stand in a thoroughgoing connection according to necessary laws, and hence in a transcendental affinity, of which the empirical affinity is a mere consequence. And maybe I want to say something about that latter claim. What Kant is telling us is that we can know a priori that all the appearances have an affinity, right? The potential for being bound up in empirical laws. So what is given to us a priori are not the empirical laws, but the possibility and necessity of empirical laws. Right? We know that they have to be there, and we know that we can seek for them and find them. Right? That is what is given to us a priori. We know in advance that the world will be law-like. Not so much that it will have these or that laws, but it will be law-like. Exactly in what ways? Well, that's something that we are going to see later when we get to the analytic of principles. Okay, and then Kant tells us that, isn't it beautiful how transcendental idealism solves our philosophical problems? Next up, the third section of the A Deduction.